Royal College of Psychiatrists. In the revised guidance, there's quite a lot about the transparency of the cost of publishing and breaking down all the services. I was just wondering, and then there's also a kind of narrative that there's enough money in the pot and it's just about redistributing it. I was just wondering if any of the panellists have thought about how that money pot may change once we have to start putting the cost of peer review, and would that come with a demand of starting to pay peer reviewers, for instance, or how much, you know, the editor's time actually costs, and putting those into the pot as well?
So, Theo from the BMJ, and for my money that comes under the heading "Show me the data." We don't have this sort of information that's being asked for. I can start to partition my editorial team according to who does, whether they do triage or peer review. But, you know, this seems to me a most extraordinary request. And, you know, we're a HighWire customer. Would HighWire like us to make public how much we pay for our hosting services? It's just not... I can't quite see how this is going to work. What I think we can do is say, for example, within our portfolio, there are more selective journals and less selective journals. Yes, the additional cost of the APC is paying for selection. We can broadly say this part is pre-acceptance processing and post-acceptance. I'm not sure we would want to reveal exactly what we pay editors on different journals. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that not to mention whether we'll be subject to sort of antitrust, anti-compete legislation if we all start talking about that together. So I think that one's on that one, I'm on the, let's just leave it for the time being and see how that plays out.
I'll admit that we're trying to map our transparent APCs, but trying to very broadly put things like peer review into a whole chunk rather than editors and administrators and manuscript tracking system. But you know, at the moment, Plan S say that they're going to produce a list of those, so we'll probably have to just do what's on their list, though they may listen to us. I think there was another aspect to your question, which was about the size of the pot. And I think that the funders are telling us that the pot of money can stay the same and that everything is going to be fine. But the talks that I've heard from the consortia say that while they're currently going for a cost-neutral type of agreement, they are looking for savings in the future. And so I do think that as publishers we will need to look at options for cost savings as well. I know that we always do that, we're always looking at efficiency, but we may need to make some harsh decisions in the future if that pot does get smaller.
Yeah, we've asked this question this morning as well. What do you exactly mean with cost and splitting up the cost? And from what I understood, Coalition S is at the moment looking more at transparent pricing plus publishers listing the services that are included in this price. And whether you as a publisher, because you are very efficient in what you're doing, have a high margin on that, yes or no. They're not really interested in that, but they want to make APCs comparable. And of course, you can only make that really comparable if it is clear what kind of service is included. For us, this could be, for example, a very complicated typesetting of an article that contains a lot of Greek or Arabic. It could be specific, a very high-level copy editing, or it could be for another publisher something totally different. I mean, with a cost, with a total pot, I do think there is enough money in the pot, and I hope that, and I will also we will in our negotiations with consortia, and we're already doing that, emphasize the fact that there are some publishers that are low cost and high output, and there are some publishers that are high cost and maybe not so high output, and that maybe the pot can stay the same, but they also consortia have to have the courage to redistribute the money to make the entire system a fairer system.
So, go ahead.
I think you make a really good point, and having said our data isn't great, I will say I've seen from another publisher some data saying of the institutions who have published with us, if they were now on a read and publish type deal. We know what they pay as subscribers. We know what they've published. And there's a tiny minority for whom the cost would be about the same. But there's a huge number of institutions who subscribe who don't publish. And then there are a huge number of institutions who publish a lot more than their subscription would pay for. So it may be this big pot is the same, but for individual members of consortia, individual consortia, things may be very different. You would expect in a revised model that Harvard and Stanford start paying more because they publish more and smaller institutions pay less.
It's a real, the first time open access started being discussed, so this goes back 15 years, most of us at Stanford looked at it and said that'll never work because of course Stanford would end up paying more and many institutions in the States would end up paying almost nothing at all. So the challenge that we saw within Stanford, maybe some of you work within a large research intensive institution like a Stanford, but the pots of money come in different ways and you can't just move them around. It's not legal to do that. So the funds that pay for subscriptions come in through grants, but they're marked as overhead expenses. And those overhead monies can't be used for direct payments like APCs. So Stanford couldn't subvene, and it's almost as difficult to move it in the other direction as well. You'd have to take up collections from faculty to pay for subscriptions. So I think the idea that there's enough money, that may be true, probably is true, but it's easy to move it, I think is probably not true. Unless you have these intermediaries who essentially, I'll joke, I'll call it money laundering. That's what they're moving the money from one pocket to another, and because there's an intermediary, it may work.
So while I agree that there's enough money in this system, and I did quite a lot of analysis on that when I was still at Elsevier, but with a lot more analytic capacity than I currently have as a consultant. I'm quite convinced of that. It is difficult, it means moving it around, but I would just gently but firmly push back on the idea that a move to a transformative agreement means that research intensives with a lot of article outputs have got to pay even more than they do now. I used to be a consortial negotiator for all the UK universities and FE colleges, and those research intensives already make the lion's share contribution to the subscription budgets, right? And if you continue to ramp up their contributions, you would see, I think, the potential collapse of the consortia altogether. So as publishers, we need to be a little bit more clever. Again, readers benefit as well as authors in an open access world. There are ways to charge to reflect the value that we're adding in both of those communities.
Going back to the original question, I think one of the things to do is to go look at that rationale document. Revisit it to see what they say about this. My recollection is that the new focus on APC transparency and the new guidance comes as a result of giving up on the APC cap. So what they're trying to do is avoid a repeat of something that happened a few years ago when essentially everybody looked at the APCs everybody else was charging and said, they're charging more, we will too. And so APCs rose, not entirely, but they want to make sure that their market intervention doesn't create a market that just has costs rising. So this is a way of pushing back on that. I'm not sure in this country, but my mental image when I first read that was they want something like the nutrition statements on packaged foods. That makes it easy to compare. Well, I had a boss who worked on those, and he said it was incredibly political what went into those nutrition statements. In other words, the sugar industry didn't want it called sugars. They wanted it called carbohydrates, which nobody knew. What are they? So I think we'll probably go through a phase of gradually getting there, but it may be the principles that guide more than the details.
And I think, if I understood you correctly, you're saying something that I'll use a different analogy. It's more like a fixed price menu. And you're saying your fixed price menu over here will get you good copy editing, good, highlighting, social media, whatever you want. Your fixed price menu over here gets you a Big Mac, and you know what you're getting for that. And that's a reasonable ask.
It plays into the hands of the bigger publishers a bit as well, who have the economies of scale to offer, to have cheap typesetting and cheaper production compared to some of the, more niche boutique publishers who really pride themselves on that service that they give to authors in terms of producing, their back of the cigarette packet sketch into a wonderful, living, breathing diagram that features in the journal. So.
That's your artisan baker.
That's the case already.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the situation already, so that's not changed.
So our board of directors wasn't comfortable in currently announcing how much it actually costs per article, but we have made a statement to say that our current APC is heavily subsidised, and that the real cost of quality publishing are much higher than we currently charge.
One of the things you might see is more a pie chart approach to the APC rather than giving actual dollars. Pounds, whatever, you may see, okay, 20% goes to this, 30% goes to that. I wonder if that's what will come out. Other questions, comments? We didn't, I think only one of us, Alicia, I think in your talk you listed multiple transformative approaches, and subscribe to open was at the bottom. I can say from the SSP meeting that the session that I moderated on Plan S was standing room only in the audience. The subscribe to open session was almost as full, which meant that about 30% of the attendees were there. So that model is getting a lot of interest. There was an excellent talk by Raym Crow on the philosophical and economics and business underpinnings for subscribe to open. I'm going to try and get Raym to do a webinar on that. It was excellent. He nearly convinced me until after the session was over, I talked to several of our publishers and they told me why it wouldn't work. But I think for certain types of publishers, publishers perhaps got a very stable set of publications. You're not constantly adding new publications. You're not trying to grow your number of subscribers by 50% a year. Where you've got essentially a very mature subscriber base, there might be something to look at there. So that's the annual reviews model called Subscribe to Open. There's been a very good post on it on Scholarly Kitchen that I'd recommend. One of the things that I find interesting, you didn't ask for like a show of hands of people interested in in collaborating on transformative agreements. Your colleague in our DC meeting did. Could we get a show of hands of people who are interested in collaborations on transformative agreements? All right.
Yeah, reasonable amount. Yeah, absolutely. I think
so. The number, I'm going to make a point that there might be something geographic. I was about to say geologic. Geographic here. There was no interest in the DC meeting in the States, or at least no one willing to put their hands up.
I think that's the feedback that we get, is the publishers in the US are still very much in defensive mode. They're like, what is Plan S going to cost me? Rather than how can I turn this to my advantage? How can we turn this into a benefit? There seems to be a real complete change.
So I think that's really important to figure out. For those of us who work in multiple geographies,
Yep.
You need to know where to spend your time and attention. I thought an interesting comment that Simon made about the number crunching, that there's number crunching before you get involved. In a transformative agreement, you need to know your numbers before you sit down with, especially a consortium. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's a consortium you're not doing business with as a consortium. It might be good for some of us to work together on what what are the elements in a model? Where do they come from? What can you substitute for them? I'm hoping that there are some of you who are already well into this. There might be some consulting organizations that are well into this, and we can all work together to come up with a good model that might be reusable across very different organizations. I guess my question to all of you is, do you know of such, or are you working on such? And
So that's the objective of the workshop we've convened on Monday, to bring library consortia and publishers together to co-create a consensus about the data points that are needed up front, the structure for model agreement, and what reporting would be needed afterwards, and a light touch implementation. What will be?
you're going to get all that done in one day?
There are really good people coming, and we're not going to let them go. So fingers crossed, who knows?
Good.
But what will be needed is to test that with a much broader spectrum of organizations, and we'll need an AccuComms to actually help implement that. I think there could be a tremendous quick project here, and publishers are under the caution in terms of the time scale, right? If you need transformative agreements in place by 2021, you need to be figuring out this year in your ongoing renewal cycle if this has any legs for you whatsoever. So the faster we could get a practical test going, the better. And if the feedback on what comes out of our workshop is that it's half-baked or it needs more work, we can continue to evolve that. But happy to work with anybody.
Half-baked is better than raw ingredients still being assembled. I think half-baked sounds good, relatively.
I don't know if we have anyone from JISC in the room, but I know JISC are working on exactly this sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks to Plan S, we are in the situation where we are at the table finally to discuss about transformative agreements and to hopefully transform the one we have, an offsetting deal in the Netherlands, into a proper transformative agreement. But it is at this point in time a lot of just counting and calculating by hand, collecting the data in a very in a very time-consuming process. Basically, a person going through our journals and looking at the affiliations. So this is, I think, something where we are also looking at how can we make our data better to understand not only where authors are affiliated with, but also where the funding is coming from. This is something that we really, by the end of the year, have to have a better situation, so that we can just press a button and it comes out, so that we can quickly negotiate with those partners. But at the moment, it's very time-consuming data gathering. But I understand also from bigger publishers with them, it is pretty similar.
I was actually surprised at how much, at the meeting with SURF, how much homework they'd done as well. So they constantly collecting this data and analysing the number of, as I said, authors from Dutch institutes. So I think one of the important things is actually to speak to the consortium and see what data and information that they have already and what they're going to need in order to help with these negotiations as well.
It would be obviously great if the consortia and the publishers needed the same data. And then you would have the basis for transparency, at least people talking about the same numbers. Yeah, I don't know that that's practical, but that would be...
Since there are also a lot of intermediaries, that's really a difficult thing. It's very difficult to achieve. What the holding of the consortia or the institution is not necessarily what we have in our data. That's quite amazing, actually, that this is not one-on-one, but it is the case. And there are sometimes quite large differences.
Yeah. All right. Any closing questions, suggestions, comments?
Thank you. I'm Henry Spielberg from BMJ, one of the associate publishers. Alicia, you made a very interesting comment about APCs not being seen as a viable transition model, and I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more, because I think probably that there are assumptions, I'm certainly guilty of it, that you kind of assume the APC is the be-all and end-all, but if that isn't really the future, then what is?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because again and again in the workshops we've done over the course of our project, it has dawned on me that the conversation in the room at any particular given point in time was because most of the publishers were assuming whenever we talked about open access that we were talking about the APC model, and they would tend to get anxious because they weren't convinced that all of their authors in their hybrid titles or their fully subscription titles were going to have access to enough funding to pay APCs to enable them to transition their titles. So the minority of business models that we identified in our discussion document are based on article transaction payments by the author. I think there are two, so APCs and submission fees. All of the others operate at a higher level of granularity. And if you think about it from a publishing perspective, you've got revenue flowing into your business now from a variety of sources, including APCs. But you've got this library money coming in, you've got money from agents of various kinds, internationally, and all of those can be leveraged to support open access publishing. So I think that's where the creative energy can repay itself. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and I think it relates to something about the size of the pot and is there enough money. Apocryphally, I can't speak to the evidence of this, but when Medline moved from being something we used to receive on floppy disks to PubMed being a public service, their calculations showed that putting a paywall in front of it would be more expensive than the amount of revenue they could get back. So we need to remember that we do a lot of work at the moment having paywalls and collecting revenues, and that includes collecting individual APCs. And actually, if there is a transition to a more direct route of funders paying for the access they want, which is open, it benefits all of us because we can spend more of the money on doing the research and disseminating it and less on transactional costs of the model that we've now set up.
Let me add, it's a really good question, and I think the most interesting thing I've read on that recently was Alison Muddett writing last week in a post on the Scholarly Kitchen. Now, many of you might know Alison is the CEO for PLOS, so you'd say, well, of course Alison's going to be an advocate for open access. But before that, she was the head of University of California Press, which is in some ways like Brill in that it has many humanities and social sciences journals. And before that, she was, I forget which area, she was an executive in Sage Publishing, so social science publishing. So she has a very broad background and has seen these issues. And her point is essentially that APCs aren't going to work for everyone. That it disenfranchises, in particular, the global South, which is the term being used more and more for the certain regions, and that means we have to keep searching. It can't be an exclusive model, but I recommend her post. It looked like it was going to be about what's different in the new Plan S, but it was really more about keeping a good understanding of what the objective is behind all this. Thank you all very much.